Morning, everybody. Wanted to just address, I have a friend, Rabbi Meza, who makes a lot of videos, very popular on YouTube, has been for a long time. As one critic of his once said to me, a rabbinical critic of his, he said, he has a very long, and he say virtual paper trail or internet paper trail. I don't remember what the words were. It was 12 years ago or something. So hard to believe how time flies, So anyway, he recently he's pretty much been doing a podcast with live call-in, and he has conversations with different people, and then he puts the recordings of it on YouTube for people to listen to. And Rabbi Meza said that essentially, he said, that there was two parts. It was, the name of the video was something about like Catholic Hasidim or Hasidic Catholicism, really comparing, which I've done in the past, comparing the traditional veneration of saints in various religious traditions to show it's not really that different. And that was really his message that he was saying there, that we shouldn't, he said, as much as he of course disagrees with Christianity and Catholicism and so forth, he was trying to argue, and as much as he disagrees personally as more of a rationalist with the veneration of saints, he still nonetheless will admit that it's not idolatrous. And that was the gist of what he was saying. But before he got to that, which is a separate issue, he was discussing the claims of dualism in Christianity. Pretty much that Christianity, he didn't say it in these words, but that Christianity adopted the dualistic ideology of Zoroastrianism, and how the idea of God versus Satan in what I would say cultural Christianity has been accused of being dualistic the way Rabbi Meza said it. He said that biblical Judaism is not guilty of this, and I'm going to refute this claim. What he claims is that rabbinical Judaism is just as guilty as Christianity is, and my refutation would want to be that, really going along the lines of what Rabbi Meza said about veneration of saints, it depends, but to a certain extent, what I would say is more scholarly, and I don't mean secularly scholarly. I mean just an educated Christian would not be a dualist, but maybe a less educated Christian might come to the conclusions of more of a dualistic ideology, similar to Zoroastrian dualism, although some secular scholars really still want to argue that Zoroastrianism is essentially monotheistic, and that I know that it doesn't matter the names, whatever, I'm not going to get into that, the Yesham al Picha, but that the more devil creature in Zoroastrianism is also not really a god in the way would be traditionally understanding it. Again, we can argue back and forth on the merits and demerits of that argument. It's not really the time and place for that. But what I basically and briefly wanted to address was his claims that rabbinical Judaism, which he adheres to in a halachic sense at least, I think really his ideology, which is I would say is kosher. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on this particular issue, is that the primacy of Judaism in I would say universal level, but I don't mean universal in the sense of world universality, but universal in the sense of the particularities of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, in general orthodoxy, brought down to its lowest common denominators, that it's still orthodox, is what I'm saying. Because of the various views on the issue, would say that halacha has primacy, and even though we're orthodox as opposed to orthoprax, which is something that I argue very strongly about, is that doctrine is something that's primary, at least confessed doctrine, stated doctrine, meaning we express our doctrine in our confession of faith and in our prayers. But let's move aside from that. Is that essentially what he was saying here, though, what essentially he says is that, agadic statements, the way he says it, are disposable. I don't like that term. What I tend to say is that they are meant to be taken in a mythological sense rather than in a logical sense, as Jung would put it. And Karen Armstrong talks about this a lot. The difference between mythos and logos in world religion, and the tendencies of extremism by failing to find a balance between the two in some form. I think it's a brilliant thesis that Karen Armstrong has about mythos and logos. And it's something I know Rabbi Bart Zadok talks about quite often. Especially, he's a Jungian therapist. But to get back to what we're talking about here, and I'm sorry I'm pausing so much and so forth. I'm trying to think while I'm driving also. So, although for me this is good because it keeps my eyes on the road because I'm not looking at the camera, But in that Jungian sense of the balance, that's a different story. But let's just focus right now on what we're talking about. Essentially, what Rabbi Meza would argue is that what binds us as Orthodox Judaism is halacha is universally binding. Universally, I mean among the whole Jewish people, by the teachings of Chazal, vis-a-vis the rulings of the Sanhedrin, and that pretty much anything else is optional at best. Disposable is a term he uses often, which I don't like. But and sometimes he calls it fluff or this and that, and but he's a very logical type and doesn't see the value in mythos, which again is what Karen Armstrong, again, she's not any authority, but there is a statement, Yesh Chochma B'Amim Tamen, if they believe whatever, if they say there's wisdom among the nations, you should believe it. And I believe this is a level of wisdom among the nations, what she's saying, and I believe that it's borne out in the ideas that many of our Rishonim have taught vis-a-vis halacha versus agadata, and that the realm of halacha and agadata are, in a sense, identical to what Karen Armstrong would say in a Jungian language of mythos and logos. Anyway, with all this being said, so what Rabbi Meza's claim is vis-a-vis dualism and the idea of Satan in Judaism and the idea of Satan in Christianity being different, he wants to claim that they're more similar than we think, and he said that certain apologists, rabbis who, apologists for Judaism, are being disingenuous in this manner by presenting a more solo scriptura approach and ignoring rabbinical traditions here, vis-a-vis this issue of Satan and apparent dualism that many in the secular world will say really came out of Zoroastrianism, which I don't think is actually that accurate. If anything, the certainly, if you want to, we don't really separate biblical Judaism and rabbinic Judaism in our tradition, but you have to recognize the scholarly approach that does, in a certain sense, separate the two, and see the two as distinct. But essentially, biblically, Isaiah 45, wipes out the Zoroastrian view in a very direct way, and it's directed to a Zoroastrian, to Cyrus, who wasn't even born yet, and yet Isaiah calls him by name and repudiates his apparent, dualistic worldview, which is also essentially, in a certain sense, a type of a Gnostic view later in history. But in a quite of course, the Gnostics took it in a radically opposite way. And that's one of the things Rabbi Meza claims, is that Christianity came out of Gnostic Judaism, which really doesn't really make much sense in any intellectually honest way that I can see. I don't know where this claim is coming from. In any event, let's get back to the subject at hand. So his claim essentially was that because the Chazal say that Hua Yetzahara, Hua Satan, Hua Malach HaMaves, that the Yetzahara, the kind of the devil on your shoulder, is identical with the Satan and is identical with the angel of death, that would bear out to say that, and I don't know how this claim is being made, it doesn't really make much sense even at face value, that really essentially the Jewish view of Satan is identical to the Christian view of Satan, and that both are essentially dualistic. Now, first of all, I was taught in yeshiva in high school. What does that mean? Hua Yetzahara, Hua Satan, Hua Malach HaMaves. When I brought this up to Rabbi Dax in Ezra Academy. He should be well. So, the way he explained it to me, Rabbi Dax was a student of Rabbi Victor Miller, who we talked about yesterday, Zechus Yigalenu, Labat L'chaim, Rabbi Dax. So Rabbi Dax in Ezra Academy told me, this was a personal discussion he and I had, he said that the meaning of that passage in Chazal is as follows, that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the cartoon devil on your shoulder type, when there's the angel on the shoulder and devil on your shoulder in the cartoons, right? Mythologically speaking, of course, that leads us into sin. That very sin itself testifies in court against us, mythologically speaking, of course, and is our prosecuting attorney. Is a witness, or is at least a witness for the prosecution. So that's why he's the Satan. The Satan means the opponent, so it's like the prosecutor, essentially, the accuser, in a certain sense. And is the Malach HaMavis, meaning is the one who carries out as well, meaning the sin itself, in a sense, that we've committed. It is a very rational approach to a statement that at its face value is mythological. And these are the types of things I'd like to share with my more rational friends about the real true meaning of all of these types of statements, whether in Agadata or in Kabbalah. Or is that essentially the revelation of this idea is the idea that's being taught here in Chazal, in the teachings of our sages that are, mythological and agadic in nature, is a rational idea, meaning that the sin itself is what accuses you, it's what gives you the guilt, and is your punishment. It metes out the punishment. It is the angel of death. It doesn't necessarily have to mean death, but whatever punishment or correction a person receives, meaning he's the accuser and he's the executioner, is the sin itself. And that's as the Christians would say, the wages of sin are death. It's that type of idea, and then so it's not talking in any sense an ideology of who or what Satan is and this and that, but rather that it's this idea of the Satan being this more of a myth than an actual being, in a certain sense, is how you might want to understand it. Although the reality of myth also has to be acknowledged. The reality of the realm of thought, the reality of... This is where I want to make Birkas Ilanos. Maybe on the way home today we'll stop and look. Anyway, so let's... it's the story of Birkas Ilanos. The Boston Rebbe had a neighbor, an Italian-American neighbor, who said, he saw the Boston Rebbe making a Birkas Ilanos. He said, "How come the rabbi no bless my tree? It didn't make any fruits." And then he prayed for the tree. He said the tree didn't grow any fruit for years and years. And then the next year, he got the bracha from Boston Rebbe, and it grew fruit. So I'm a quarter Italian, so I could do the accent, right? I have total joke immunity. Back to what we were saying. So then he also ignores a whole body of, so again, his thesis is essentially that Job presents the Satan as merely one of the angels that is totally subservient to God, and which is true. Oh, look at these beautiful turkeys! Wow, beautiful wild turkeys here, and the and yet the rabbinical tradition presents a more of a Christian view of it that's dualistic. That's what he's claiming here. He's ignoring a whole body of rabbinical literature, really. In the same passage there in Baba Basra is where we really have the major discussion about Satan in the Talmud, where it comments on Job. And the rabbinical view of Satan is a rather sympathetic one, that this guy is a victim of circumstances. He's being ordered by God to do things that are extremely difficult. For example, and I know that's going to sound shocking to people, particularly because the Christian view, which is the major difference between the Jewish and Christian worldview about Satan, is that the Christian view is that when Isaiah speaks of the fall of how they of the light bearer, of what they translate as Lucifer, based on the Jerome's Vulgate, that the fall of Lucifer, which in context is obviously a mythological condemnation of King Nebuchadnezzar, using the parable of the planet Venus as a symbol, and its own fall in the sky as a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's own fall. And that's in the fall of Babylon, and that's what's going on there in that passage in Isaiah. And yet, so many Christians have developed their own midrash on this, which I don't forgive them to do. Just the opposite. I often point out that this shows that Christians are also not sola scriptura. Protestant Christians who claim this banner of sola scriptura are not sola scriptura, because they also have their own midrashim, their own homiletical interpretations of Scripture. And so when and back to really what Rabbi Meza was talking about here, it's like when Protestants are bashing Catholics for having oral traditions, they're just as guilty of the same thing. But again, in the rabbinical tradition, so when God tells Satan that he could attack Job's body as long as he doesn't kill him, he said that's like telling someone, I want you to take apart this wine cask, take off all the walls of the barrel, but not let one drop of wine spill. And then when this teaching was brought, they said that the Satan himself came and kissed the feet of this rabbi for defending him and realizing how hard his job is. If we get into the Zohar, which I know Rabbi Meza repudiates its authenticity, but even I know some people who, as he's discussed with personally as well, who repudiated the authenticity of the Zohar, who nonetheless accept it as part of our canon, even if it's in the mythological sense, even if it's not in the historical and logical sense, and it doesn't really matter, I don't think. I don't believe it to be a forgery. Again, these are discussions for another time. And the other thing is, there are many books which come to defend, apologetic works that defend the authenticity of the Zohar. and there's a little bit of everything, and you have both. But anyway, it's really not neither here nor there. It's not the point. The mashal that the Zohar brings, that the Tanya quotes, or at least mentions, is real. The parable that the Zohar brings about who the Satan is definitely the opposite of a dualistic view of Satan. The Zohar brings the Satan as the following mashal, the following parable to explain. They said there was a king who wanted to make sure that his son was chaste, was noble and ethical, moral enough to be worthy to the throne, to be his heir to the throne. And so in order to tempt and test the son, the king hired a woman to pose as a harlot to try to tempt him, with the hopes that the son would overcome the temptation and not fall into sin with this harlot. And so all the while the harlot is doing her job that she's being paid for to try to tempt him, but really in her heart she's kind of rooting for the son for the prince not to be tempted and not to fall, and that she really shouldn't be successful. But what can she do? She was given a job and she has to do it. And that's who the Satan is. Not a rebel against God the way that the Christian homilies would have us understand, but rather a totally subservient servant of God who is doing a job that he really doesn't want to do, and he wants to, and he really is rooting against himself and rooting for us as well to defeat him. And we don't want, and he himself doesn't want to win. He is, almost like a fighter throwing a fight. He wishes he could, but he can't, type of thing. Or the Black Sox, throwing the World Series, So that's essentially, what we have here in the rabbinical tradition of who the Satan is. Again, this is to be understood mythologically, not to be understood logically, not to be understood literally. But then clearly it refutes that which my dear friend Rabbi Meza suggests, that rabbinical Judaism somehow embraces a dualistic view, similarly to how Christians are accused of. Now, with that being said, I've read, some Christian texts on this issue of how powerful is Satan in the Christian worldview, and everyone that I've read agree that God is more powerful than Satan. So by virtue of that it demonstrates, at the very least, that it's not really a dualistic view, because God is the one who's more powerful, and which would seem to indicate that God is allowing Satan's existence. Again, from the Jewish worldview, it would be because God wants to give us a greater reward. In order to give us the greater reward, the nature of human beings, which God created. Although that's when we get into the realm of mystery. Is this something essential, or is this something created? Is how people are embarrassed when they receive something for free. Nahamid the Ksufa is what the bread of embarrassment, the bread of shame, that someone when someone is receiving charity, and so that's why, you know, even though essentially everything is by God's grace, God creates at least the illusion of, you know, what the Christians might call salvation by works. We don't understand it in that sense, but that the necessity of works is because of God's love for us, that he wants us to feel the satisfaction of works. And so we don't see it in the realm of salvation as much as in the realm of love, that God gives us the opportunity of works in order that we can appreciate the value of a hard day's work. And there was a parable I read yesterday about there was someone walking. They met this, you know, poor hillbilly family, you know, who their whole livelihood was this one cow, and you know, they lived in this dilapidated shack, and they were all disheveled, and they and their kids were all disheveled, but they were happy. And then the guru told his student to kill the cow, push it off the cliff when they're not looking. And he said, "How could I do this? I'm going to take away their whole livelihood." And the guru said, "Just do it. Trust me." So then a few years later, the student came back and found they were living in a mansion. I mean, maybe not a mansion, but much more comfortable, you know. And he said, and he almost didn't recognize it was the same people. He almost thought, you know, maybe someone else moved in here. And what they realized was that, you know, when he asked him, you know, "Do you remember?" He said, "Yeah, and just after you were here, our cow died. And so my wife and I, we went back to school, and things got a lot better since then." You know, meaning they were taken out of their comfort zone, and they were able to grow. And so this act of throwing the cow off the cliff, which of course would be forbidden to do, you're never allowed to steal, that would be considered theft, and it would be a grave sin in real life to do such a thing. But this is a parable. This is not an actual teaching. And the message there, it's along the lines of what Rabbi Torsky says, the story about the lobster. You know, how a lobster feels pain, and that's how he knows it's time to shed his shell and grow a new shell. And if he didn't feel the pain, he would never grow. And so too, you know, we're filling ourselves up with painkillers. Are we stunting our growth by avoiding pain? And so that's the message here. Of how we deal with this. And so that's the whole job of the Satan here, is to give us pain, and no pain, no gain, to be like the drill sergeant, you know, so we can grow and become someone greater than we were before. So that's the story here. And then essentially, I would say, even though Christians do believe that the Satan rebelled and that he's not a faithful servant of God, nonetheless, God had to allow that rebellion to take place. And so although there might be disagreements with the precise details of this rebellion, or why Satan is who he is, and the mechanism. Still, it's an educated Christian would not believe that Satan is co-equal power to God. And again, that might be just something that comes from popular culture as opposed to any authentic Christian worldview, even with the idea that Satan rebelled, which, although I would disagree with this idea. And then the thing is that then Rabbi Meza mentioned something about demons, and the existence of demons in rabbinic literature also somehow points to this dualistic ideology, which it does not in any way. That I can absolutely refute, and it just shows his ignorance of how demons are viewed in rabbinic literature, and certainly in Kabbalistic literature. Demons are mentioned in the Bible, although there's no biblical statement that I can think of that would necessarily point to them actually necessarily existing. However, certainly it certainly leaves the possibility open, but not the necessity in the Hebrew Bible. The Christian, books that they call the New Testament certainly would seem to necessitate the existence of demons as a reality. But with all of that being said, the rabbinical and Kabbalistic view of demons are much more similar to the Islamic and pre-Islamic Arab view of genies, as we say in English, which seem to really, it would seem that the Arab view of jinn really was based in a Greco-Roman ideology that predates the Arab mythology. Which again, it seems that all of these are pointing to something that actually exists, as opposed to a myth, is what I would understand, in a logical, scientific sense. Although again, you can argue back and forth on these questions, but that they are not the Denzians, the minions of Satan. I mean, the very virtue of the fact that, and the one thing that he claimed, that Rabbi Meza claims, is that the Samech Mem is the king of the demons, which he's not. He's the angel of evil, but not the king of the demons. He might very well be the Satan, the Yetzer Hara, and the Malach HaMavis. And sometimes it's called the Baldavar, and so forth. Certainly, someone would want to stay away from someone who's an enemy to us, but not an enemy to God. Both in Judaism and Christianity, I would say that the Satan is the enemy of man and not the enemy of God. But even his enemy of man state is one of, he's a victim of circumstances, like Curly Howard would say. This is going way too long. Back to, let's get back. But the idea of demons in the Gemara and Gittin, the king of the demons is Ashmedai, who's called Asmodeus in other languages, a creature that appears throughout mythology of various traditions, as being, at least at that very time, the reigning king of the demons. Not necessarily somebody who is forever the king of the demons, and it could also be a title, whatever it is. But essentially, for those who are not familiar with the Islamic or pre-Islamic Arab view of genies, not necessarily these guys giving you wishes also, although that's part of the myth, And that's what shadim are. That's what demons are. These are the same things. These are not the embodiment of evil that demons are presented as in most Christian views. The way that an angel is the embodiment of God's will, a demon is not an embodiment of Satan's will, but rather demons, and they're not even necessarily the fallen angels, which are discussed as another part of Jewish mythology, a little bit more controversial. Not everybody agrees, but it's mentioned. But in essence, the idea of shadim, of demons, shadim, shindalit, whatever, these are just beings that live in another realm, in another dimension, if you want to use a more like sci-fi type of terminology, that's getting closer and closer to what quantum physics suggests is a true reality. And they are extraterrestrial beings or extra-dimensional beings that live in their own society, have their own religions, both in Jewish and Islamic thought. You have this imagery of demons practicing religion, practicing our same religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, being practiced by demons, having their own communities, and for the most part, and there being various races of demons, various species of demons, and for the most part we're dealing with beings that just live their own life and have no relationship to us any more than we have to animals. And really tend to be aloof from us unless there's something they can get out of it, just as we are generally aloof from the animal kingdom except for where we want to take from them, and in that sense certain people have been more or less domesticated by the demonic world and become their own, meaning human beings are the cattle of the demons. And really a healthy human will try to avoid that. And among the demons there are good demons and bad demons, and between demons. And generally the ones who are going to want to affiliate with human beings are going to be the more criminal element, because what can they get out of it? And that's really what it's all about. Well, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. Again, this is the rabbinical view. I'm not necessarily saying that this is true or false or anything else. I'm just saying how it's been presented in our mythology, and that's it. All right, but certainly I think it repudiates the idea that rabbinical Judaism is somehow dualistic in the view of God versus the devil, and really what I would prefer to say, as Rabbi Meza said about Christianity with other issues, is that it's actually the actual issue is that the Christians are also not dualists, and that rather than saying that that Judaism is down on the level of some folly of Christianity, I'd rather prefer to lift up, as Rabbi Meza is somewhat suggesting, probably unwittingly, because that's not his worldview, I would rather lift up Christianity to say that both Christianity and Judaism are not guilty of this particular folly of dualism. And we know how radically and in general, in a good way, monotheistic Islam is, and yet Islam recognizes the existence of shaitan, of Satan, of jinn, of genies, demons, whatever you want to call them, really like comparing all three, and we would see there, but certainly the Jewish view of demons is more similar to the Islamic view than what I would say popular culture Christian view, not really authentic Christian view. I don't know really that much about the authentic Christian view of it, but it's a little different also. Another difference though is that both Christians and Muslims believe that demons can possess people. Kabbalist Jews will say that demons can influence people but not possess them because they're of a different species, whereas human spirits, ghosts, can possess a person. That's the idea of the Dibuk, which again, it doesn't appear in Chazal, doesn't really appear in the Zohar either. It's something that appears later in Kabbalistic literature, but people have experienced. All right, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. Let's stay away from all these evil stuff and try to be good people. All right.